Good day and welcome to another episode of Connecting the Dots. Today we're going to look at the impact of bilateral contracts on underserved customers, which is literally everybody in Nigeria. The recent constitutional amendment has realigned electricity distribution companies, generation companies, and regulatory bodies operationalized to ensure the utmost energy access to Nigerians. This includes bilateral contracts that exclude Nigerian bulk electricity trader from aiding the purchasing ability of distribution companies. Distribution companies are transitioning to bilateral contracts, which might impact their customers at different levels. There's need to understand what provisions would be in place for customers at the lower band levels, reiterating the total energy access goal of 2030. Today, I am joined by Olajumoke Delano, Head of Regulatory and Government Regulation at Abuja Electricity Distribution Company. Welcome, Olajumoke.
Hello, Emeka. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. I know the bilateral conversation is one that's still not fully cooked yet. There's different permutations and different things that we've been observing in the sector. But I think at some point it's one that we have to discuss, given that if you look at the market rules, we're now supposed to be in the medium-term market where bilateral contracts between different players in the marketplace will take place and there won't be any need for embeds. Embed's contract got a 3-year renewal, and as it stands now, it's supposed to run its course at the end of 2024. So it's really important for sector players to start to think about what happens next and how do these bilateral contracts work. We have a massive issue in the sector with data and with also transparency and accountability, which obviously all leads to trust. And it's hard to enter into a contract if there's no trust. So these baby steps of bilateral contracts are an important step, but it's also good to know that there needs to be somebody monitoring these agreements to ensure that they're equitable and that they're fair. So Olajumoke, could you just give me a brief overview of bilateral contracts and the essence in the electricity sector?
All right. So you're absolutely right when you say it's still a work in progress. And so the transition to bilateral contracting has not, been completed yet. Why are bilateral contracts important? Or why should we be interested? You mentioned the idea of transparency. You mentioned the idea of accountability. The sector, the Nigerian electricity supply industry as we know it, is one where we've had a bulk trader, Nigeria Bulk Electricity Trading PLC, since privatization that has bought energy in bulk from the gencos and sold to the distribution companies. So essentially, the distribution companies have one seller. That's the one company selling energy to us. With the introduction of bilateral contracts, the distribution company will have the benefit of negotiating directly with the generation company to agree terms that are acceptable to both parties. One of the issues that had occurred in the past was when distribution companies felt that they were not privy to the agreements between the generation company and embeds. However, the effect of those agreements were passed through to the distribution companies. So distribution companies had at a point requested to see the contracts between the power purchase agreements between the gencos and embeds so that they could fully understand the impact that it will have on their tariffs. So that's one of the things that bilateral contracts would allow a distribution company to do. You would be able to contract on the terms that are acceptable to you. Nobody will be contracting on your behalf and passing, costs through to you that you did not negotiate. That is one of the things that would definitely be important. The other aspect of bilateral contracting, which will be beneficial for the sector, is being able to pay in full for the energy that you contract. There's no government agency that will be standing in between as a middleman. Rather, you would sign a contract, the distribution company would sign a PPA with the GENCO with terms and conditions that are acceptable to both parties, with proper securitization, proper accountability, on the parts of the parties to the agreement. So I think accountability, transparency would be at least two of the benefits that the sector would enjoy. The other aspect is, if you take energy as a distribution company from a generation company, you would have to ensure that that energy is properly allocated, and not just allocated, but you are able to fully account and do what is required to reduce your losses, to ensure that you can collect as much as you can within what is within your power to do to minimize the losses and ensure that you collect the revenue for the energy that you sold.
That's really interesting. So looking at the sector from 2013 to date, we've operated in what was called a vesting contracts with embeds. What would now be, how did those work? And I understand that they're vastly different from these bilateral contracts.
Okay, so the vesting contract is the contract that Embed signed with each disco, and the vesting contract allowed Embed to sell energy, to the distribution companies. There was a percentages of energy generated that was agreed with each disco. So for example, a disco could under that vesting contract be expected to take 10% of the total energy that is generated on a daily basis. It also provided for the securitization, provided for the fees that the disco is supposed to pay for the energy, the invoicing requirements, dispute resolution. So there was a host of things, but the issues with it I had already mentioned in your previous question. The Electricity Act says that NEC will determine at a point in the market when it feels that the market is ripe, will instruct NBET to stop signing new PPAs, or to discontinue or to novate its existing agreements. So what would happen is, instead of having a vesting contract, the distribution companies will be signing power purchase agreements with the generation companies. So that will be, in essence, the difference.
Interesting. And for power purchase agreements, from what I recall and from what I understand, there's a financial backing that's required to ensure that both parties are whole, to ensure that if a GENCO gives you 10 megawatts of power, you pay for 10 megawatts of power. And if you don't pay, there's a penalty and there's normally a letter of credit. Is that going to be the same agreement going forward? That's the first part. The second part is, given the insolvency issues that most discos have, how will these challenges met, if that's the case, to provide a letter of credit?
So good questions you've asked, Emeka. The expectation is that the GENCO and the DISCO would enter into a power purchase agreement that is, standard, with standard terms and conditions, with appropriate securitization, with liquidated damages provisions. The contracts should have, all those terms. The generation companies should also have, firm gas supply contracts, because where they are unable to deliver, they would be expected to compensate the distribution company accordingly. And the issue of providing the bank guarantees, the GENCO and the DISCO have the opportunity to negotiate the most appropriate security, that is going to be applicable to both of them. So that is the way, because the power purchase agreement is bilateral. It's two parties, so you are left to agree. But the expectation from the commission is that you must sign a take-or-pay, not a best endeavors, reasonable efforts basis contract, but it has to be a take-or-pay agreement that will make both parties accountable, to it. Now, in terms of the insolvency of the distribution of some distribution companies, there's a lot of reconciliation going on right now, even within the sector, with the different entities, in order to determine what is the actual financial position of each of these entities. So without those reconciliations having been completed, it's really hard, to tell. But the process of reconciliation is ongoing. There are some sector issues that have to be addressed, and at that point, I think when the reconciliation is through, then you'll be able to, determine the next steps in terms of ability to provide, appropriate security or otherwise. The other thing is that bilateral is being staged in phases. Not everybody is required at this point in time to progress or transition to bilateral. Some discos have been given the nudge to start this process, and some other discos are still trading with embeds because embeds still has over a year and maybe some months before their license expires.
That's an interesting thing. One question that I have that come up in several forums is if I'm a Genco and I have obligations to the grid, and now one of these, I guess, 3 discos who are the premium discos come and ask me, I want to buy power from you. How does that affect my contract with Embed or with I guess, how does that affect that contract that I'm supposed to supply X number of megawatts? Is there a pathway around that, or is it just you have to meet the grid obligations first before you now go outside of that?
Well, that's one of the issues that is being worked out, but the expectation is that the contract capacities that the 3 discos are buying from the Gencos would be novated by Embed, so it would systematically diminish their commitments to Embed. So that is the understanding, so that the distribution companies also don't end up with a double exposure under the bilateral contracts and under the vesting contracts.
This is interesting, and as someone who thinks from an economic point of view, I can see how this could cause a lot of problems if not properly managed, because you can see a pathway where if you're one of the 3 discos, you're going to go meet the hydro Gencos and some of the cheaper gas Gencos and agree, and then leave the heavy load for the grid to take care of. So it seems like there's a number of things that still need to be addressed, but it's a step in the right direction.
I can put some context on that. So, under the discussions about bilateral, you're not allowed to overcontract the hydros because that wouldn't necessarily be the first, target. So there is a limitation on how much you can contract from the hydros because there has to be equity and, the weighted average cost of energy, even to those that are buying through embeds, still must remain reasonable. Yeah. So there is a limitation on how much you can contract.
Okay, so it sounds like there's at least some sort of thoughts moving in that direction. So given where we are in the sector, we have a new act, we have states running around trying to set up their own markets. I think if you look at the sector from an outside point of view, it looks like chaos and it looks like a storm. But being on the inside, it's clear that we are making progress. It's just a matter of the progress we're making is hard to see. Policies like these begin the pathway to get government, to get the power debts of government and pass that on to business people who know how to manage risk and who know how to bring in returns to make the business viable. So while this sounds like there's still a lot to be worked out, it's a step in the right direction. Do you agree?
I do agree, that it is a step in the right direction, and it makes for you to take your destiny in your own hands, and I always like that, and for you to negotiate contracts that are acceptable to you with the entity that you have chosen, to buy from. It is a step in the right direction. It also forces efficiency, a lot of efficiency, a drive to minimize losses, a drive to increase energy access, a drive to increase collections, but not just collections for the sake of collections, but collections where you are actually meeting the power needs, and the demands of your customers and improving service delivery. Absolutely, I do see it as a step in the right direction.
Excellent. And going forward, the sector, while we spent 10 years doing privatization and moving the market forward, I think it was 10 years worth spending because there's some lessons learned so that we've learned during this time. As we move forward, we hope that there will be more and more interest in the sector but obviously people will not invest in a sector that they don't see a pathway to financial gains.
For sure.
So this is a pathway, and we're hoping that when we sit down again in the coming months, we would have seen some progress in this bilateral conversation. Thank you for joining us, Jumoke.
It's my pleasure, Mecca. Thank you for inviting me.
Have a good one, and thank you for joining Connecting the Dots. Bye-bye.